Touch me again, and I'll buy this entire airline just to fire you personally." The words hung in the recycled air of Skyward Airlines Flight 447 like a promise of reckoning. But nobody believed them, because the man who spoke them looked like he'd just finished stocking shelves at a convenience store rather than commanding boardrooms where billion-dollar deals were born and buried. Damian Cross adjusted the frayed cuffs of his Stanford hoodie and settled deeper into seat 1A, the worn cotton fabric, a deliberate contrast to the pristine leather that surrounded him. To every other passenger boarding this red-eye flight from JFK to London Heathrow, he appeared to be exactly what Linda Walsh, the senior flight attendant, would soon assume a mistake, an upgrade gone wrong, someone who didn't belong in the rarefied air of first class. The truth was infinitely more complex and exponentially more dangerous for everyone who was about to underestimate him. Damian Cross was the founder and CEO of Eclipse Capital, a shadow investment firm that had quietly woven its financial tentacles through half the major corporations in America, including the very airline whose staff was about to make the most expensive customer service mistake in aviation history. At 34, Damian had built an $8 billion empire from nothing more than coding scholarships, relentless intelligence, and a childhood spent watching his mother, Sarah Cross, clean office buildings at 3 a.m. so her son could have a chance at Princeton. Those late nights had taught him 2 fundamental truths that would serve him well in the coming hour. Dignity was more valuable than gold, and power was most effective when it moved silently through shadows. The Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime on his left wrist was worth more than most people's houses, but he kept the face turned inward against his pulse, hiding the $6 million mechanism from casual observation. This wasn't false modesty or some misguided attempt at humility. It was strategic invisibility, the kind of camouflage that allowed him to see people's true nature before they adjusted their behavior for his bank account. He had learned this lesson the hard way during his first board meeting at 26, when investors assumed the young black man in the conference room was there to serve coffee rather than present the acquisition proposal that would net them all millions. That day, he had decided to let his work speak louder than his wardrobe, and it had served him well through every subsequent business deal, hostile takeover, and corporate negotiation. But tonight, exhaustion sat heavy in his bones after 72 hours of non-stop negotiations in Tokyo, where he had just finalized the acquisition of a lithium mining conglomerate that would corner the market for electric vehicle batteries. The deal had required him to speak fluent Japanese, understand mining engineering principles, and outmaneuver 3 other billionaire bidders who had underestimated the quiet man in the hoodie, until it was far too late. JFK Terminal 4 buzzed with the restless energy of delayed flights and stranded passengers as a late October storm lashed against the massive windows, turning the runway lights into impressionist streaks of red and gold. Inside the gate area, Damian had observed the familiar ecosystem of modern air travel business. Executives hammering away at laptops, families corralling excited children, solo travelers lost in books or podcasts, and the ever-present divide between those who flew for necessity and those who flew for luxury. He had purchased Seat 1A not for status or legroom, but for the promise of silence during the 8-hour flight that would allow him to recover from the intellectual marathon of the Tokyo negotiations and prepare for the London meetings that awaited him. Sleep had become a luxury he could rarely afford, but the first-class cabin offered the closest thing to sanctuary that 37,000 feet could provide. As he buckled his seatbelt and closed his eyes, Damian had no way of knowing that in exactly 47 minutes his desire for peace and quiet would collide catastrophically with Linda Walsh's assumptions about who deserved respect in the sky setting in motion, a chain of events that would ground an entire airline, destroy several careers, and ultimately rewrite the rules of passenger dignity across the aviation industry. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest that was about to be unleashed inside the aluminum tube of Flight 447, where appearances would prove deceiving power would reveal its true face, and a torn hoodie would become the most expensive piece of clothing in corporate history. Linda Walsh had been a flight attendant for 15 years, long enough to develop what she considered an expert eye for reading passengers. And right now, her instincts were screaming that something was wrong with the man in seat 1A. She stood at the galley counter, methodically arranging champagne flutes while stealing glances at Damien Cross, who sat peacefully with his eyes closed, looking entirely too comfortable in a space she believed he had no business occupying. The irony was lost on Linda that she herself had once been judged by the same superficial metrics she now employed against others. Growing up in rural Alabama, she had fought her way through community college with a thick accent that marked her as different, unsophisticated, not quite right for the polished world of commercial aviation. Her first year as a flight attendant had been a brutal education in class consciousness, where passengers regularly dismissed her intelligence based on her drawl and working-class mannerisms. But instead of developing empathy for others who faced similar prejudice, Linda had internalized the very hierarchy that had once wounded her, using her position as senior cabin crew to perpetuate the same cruel dynamics that had made her early career so painful. She had learned that in the ecosystem of commercial aviation power was scarce and precious, and the easiest way to secure her place was to ensure that someone else remained beneath her in the social order. This psychological transformation had been gradual but complete, turning her from a victim of class discrimination into its willing enforcer, someone who now took genuine pleasure in putting passengers in their place when she perceived them as stepping outside the boundaries of what their appearance and perceived status should afford them. The beautiful cruelty of it was that she could frame this behavior as maintaining standards or following protocol, giving institutional cover to what was essentially personal revenge against a world that had once made her feel small. Captain Robert Kane represented another facet of the toxic culture that was about to explode across Flight 447. A former Navy pilot who had never quite adjusted to civilian life, Kane ran his cockpit and his aircraft like a military operation where questioning authority was tantamount to mutiny and hierarchy was sacred law. His 20 years in commercial aviation had only reinforced his belief that order, discipline, and unquestioning obedience were the pillars that kept planes in the sky and passengers safe. What Kane had never understood, despite decades of experience, was that the military command structure that worked effectively in combat situations became dangerously dysfunctional when applied to civilian service where authority needed to be earned through competence and respect, rather than simply demanded through rank and intimidation. His approach to passenger relations was fundamentally adversarial, viewing any challenge to his decisions as a personal attack on his authority that needed to be crushed swiftly and completely. The third element of this approaching perfect storm walked through the cabin door with all the subtle grace of a peacock in mating season. Tyler Richmond was everything that America's elite private schools and trust fund culture could produce when left unchecked by accountability or consequence. At 28, he had never worked a day in his life, never been told no by anyone with the power to enforce it, and never faced a situation where his father's money and connections couldn't smooth over any problem he created. Tyler's entire existence revolved around social media validation and the performance of wealth for his 100,000 Instagram followers who watched his every move with the kind of obsessive attention usually reserved for reality television stars or exotic animals in captivity. He moved through the world with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never encountered a door that wouldn't open for him or a seat that wasn't automatically his by right of birth and financial privilege. As Tyler approached row 1, talking loudly on his phone about the inconvenience of commercial travel and the people he had to deal with in public spaces, he represented everything that was wrong with a culture that confused wealth with worth and treated service workers as essentially invisible, unless they were failing to anticipate his needs quickly enough. His presence in the first-class cabin wasn't just about comfort or convenience. It was about maintaining the natural order where people like him occupied the premium spaces, while people like Damien, at least in Tyler's worldview, belonged somewhere else. Linda watched Tyler's approach with the kind of deferential attention she reserved for passengers who looked the part of first-class travelers, noting his expensive Italian suit, his confident demeanor, and most importantly, his obvious expectation that the world would rearrange itself to accommodate his preferences. This was her ideal passenger, someone who validated her own sense of being part of an exclusive club, someone whose presence made her feel sophisticated by association. The collision between these three worldviews and Damien's quiet presence in Seat 1A was now inevitable, like tectonic plates shifting toward an earthquake that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and the consequences of treating human beings as disposable inconveniences in the pursuit of maintaining artificial hierarchies. Linda approached Damien with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from 15 years of successfully intimidating passengers into compliance, her voice deliberately loud enough to alert the surrounding seats to the spectacle she was about to create. She had perfected this performance over countless flights, using volume and theatrical authority to shame perceived violators back into their proper place in the social order. "Excuse me," she announced, her tone carrying just enough condescension to make it clear that this was not a polite inquiry, but the opening move in what she assumed would be a swift and decisive victory over someone who had clearly made an error in judgment about where he belonged on her aircraft. Damien opened his eyes slowly, the kind of measured movement that came from years of high-stakes negotiations where the first person to show emotion usually lost everything that mattered. He looked up at Linda Walsh with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with this particular brand of ignorance so many times that it had become almost boring, like a magic trick, where you could see all the wires but still had to sit through the performance. "Can I help you?" Damien asked, his voice carrying the educated precision of Princeton seminars and Harvard Business School case studies, each word carefully chosen to convey both respect and an underlying steel that suggested this conversation could go in several different directions, depending on how the next few minutes unfolded. Linda's confidence faltered for just a moment as she processed the disconnect between Damien's appearance and his manner of speaking, but she had committed to this course of action, and her pride wouldn't allow her to retreat now. "I need to see your boarding pass again," she said, tapping her tablet against her chest like a shield. "We have some irregularities in the manifest that need to be resolved before takeoff." The lie came easily because Linda had discovered years ago that most passengers would rather comply with an official-sounding request than create a scene by demanding specifics about what exactly these irregularities might be. It was a technique she had perfected for removing passengers who didn't fit her mental image of what first-class travelers should look like, and it had never failed her before. Damien reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out the crumpled boarding pass, which clearly displayed his name seat assignment and the full-fare first-class ticket he had purchased 3 days earlier. He handed it to Linda without comment, watching her face as she scanned the document with increasing desperation, searching for any legitimate reason to justify the confrontation she had already begun. Meanwhile, Tyler Richmond had arrived at row 1, his phone conversation loud enough to be heard 3 rows back, as he informed whoever was unfortunate enough to be listening about the various inconveniences of traveling with the general public and his plans to get this sorted out immediately once he reached his rightful seat. His presence added another layer of pressure to an already volatile situation. "There appears to be some kind of system error," Linda announced, her voice rising in both volume and pitch as she realized that Damien's paperwork was completely in order and her bluff was about to be called. "Mr. Richmond here is a Diamond Elite member with the airline, and his upgrades take priority over any irregular ticketing situations that might have occurred during the booking process." The beauty of this particular lie was that it sounded official enough to convince nearby passengers while giving Tyler exactly what he wanted, without requiring Linda to admit that she had simply made an assumption based on Damien's appearance. It was the kind of institutional racism that hid behind policy language and procedure, making it almost impossible to challenge without seeming unreasonable. I purchased this seat with cash. 3 days ago, Damien said calmly, his voice never rising above conversational level. There was no upgrade, no miles redemption, no system error. This is simply my seat, which I paid for in full and which I intend to occupy for the duration of this flight to London. Tyler, who had been following this exchange with growing impatience, finally inserted himself into the conversation with the casual entitlement of someone who had never doubted his right to take up space in any room he entered. "Look, buddy," he said, snapping his fingers to get Damien's attention. "I don't know what kind of confusion happened here, but this is obviously some kind of mistake. I'm Tyler Richmond, and this is my seat." The name was delivered like a trump card, accompanied by Tyler's expectation that it would carry enough weight to end the discussion immediately. In his experience, most conflicts could be resolved simply by reminding people who his father was and what kind of influence the Richmond family wielded in media and entertainment circles. Damien studied Tyler for a moment with the kind of analytical attention he usually reserved for balance sheets and market projections. "I'm not familiar with the Richmond boarding pass upgrade program," he said evenly. "Could you show me the documentation that entitles you to my seat?" The question was delivered with such genuine curiosity that it took Tyler several seconds to realize he was being mocked by someone who clearly didn't understand the social dynamics at play. In Tyler's world, documentation was for people who couldn't simply announce their names and have doors open automatically. Linda watched this exchange with growing panic as she realized that neither of these passengers was backing down, and her simple plan to remove an obviously misplaced traveler was evolving into something much more complicated and potentially embarrassing for everyone involved, especially herself. "Sir," she said to Damien, her voice now carrying a note of desperation disguised as authority, "I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and move to seat 34B, which is a lovely economy plus accommodation that I'm sure you'll find perfectly adequate for your needs." The suggestion that he move to the back of the plane was delivered with the kind of false sweetness that Linda had learned to use when she wanted to make unreasonable demands sound like generous offers. It was a technique that relied on passengers being too polite or too intimidated to call her bluff. "I'm not moving," Damien said, simply the 3 words carrying enough finality to make it clear that this was not a negotiating position but a statement of fact. "I paid $24,000 for this seat, and I intend to use what I purchased." The mention of the ticket price caused a ripple of whispers through the surrounding seats as other passengers began to realize that this was not a simple case of someone trying to sneak into first class, but something far more complex and potentially embarrassing for the airline. Linda's face flushed red as she realized that her carefully constructed scenario was collapsing around her, leaving her with only one option if she wanted to maintain her authority and Tyler's satisfaction with the airline's service. She turned sharply and marched toward the cockpit, her heels clicking against the metal floor with the staccato rhythm of someone who had just declared war and was now gathering her ammunition for the decisive battle. As she disappeared through the forward galley, Damien pulled out his phone and opened a secure application that connected him directly to Eclipse Capital's legal and financial warfare departments. He didn't call anyone yet, but his thumb hovered over a contact labeled Isaiah Cross, nuclear option, while he waited to see how far this particular display of ignorance and arrogance would be allowed to escalate. The next few minutes would determine whether this remained a simple customer service dispute or evolved into the kind of corporate destruction that would be studied in business schools for decades to come, and everyone involved was about to discover that the quiet man in the hoodie had far more power than anyone aboard Flight 447 could possibly imagine. Captain Robert Kane emerged from the cockpit with the confident swagger of a man who had spent 20 years believing that the captain's word was absolute law aboard any aircraft under his command. And he approached the situation in row 1 with the kind of military precision that had served him well in the Navy, but was about to prove catastrophically inappropriate in the delicate ecosystem of commercial passenger relations. Kane's worldview was brutally simple. Challenges to authority were like cancers that needed to be cut out quickly and completely before they could spread to other passengers and undermine the rigid hierarchy that he believed kept everyone safe at 37,000 feet. He had handled countless difficult passengers over the years, and in his experience, a firm demonstration of power usually resolved these situations within minutes. "What seems to be the problem here?" Kane asked, his voice carrying the kind of commanding authority that worked effectively on military personnel, but often backfired spectacularly with civilians who hadn't volunteered to surrender their constitutional rights when they purchased airline tickets. Linda Walsh stepped forward eagerly, seeing Kane's arrival as validation of her authority and the beginning of what she assumed would be swift resolution in her favor. "Captain, this passenger is refusing to follow crew instructions and move to his assigned seat. He's being belligerent and disruptive to the boarding process." The accusation of belligerence was particularly rich, coming from Linda, who had been speaking loud enough to be heard in economy class, while Damien had never raised his voice above conversational level. But Kane accepted her version of events without question, because it fit his preconceptions about how these conflicts typically unfolded. Sir Kane said, directing his attention to Damien with the kind of stern disapproval usually reserved for subordinates who had failed to follow direct orders. "I'm Captain Kane, and I'm commanding you to gather your belongings and move to your assigned seat immediately. This aircraft will not depart until this situation is resolved." Damien looked up at Kane with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with petty tyrants before and found them uniformly disappointing. "Captain, I'm going to suggest that you check your passenger manifest very carefully before you make any decisions that you might regret later," he said quietly. "Look up the passenger code, ECS, next to my name." The suggestion was delivered with the kind of calm authority that should have given Kane pause, but military training had taught him to interpret any questioning of his commands as insubordination that needed to be crushed immediately and publicly to maintain discipline among the rest of his passengers. "I don't need to check anything." Kane snapped, his voice rising to the level that had once intimidated junior officers, but now just made him sound like a playground bully with delusions of grandeur. "I need you off my aircraft, and I need it to happen right now." Tyler Richmond, who had been watching this confrontation with growing excitement, finally saw his opportunity to insert himself into the drama as the hero of his own social media story. "Finally, someone with authority who can handle this situation properly," he announced loudly while simultaneously pulling out his phone to begin recording what he assumed would be the satisfying conclusion to this interruption of his travel plans. Damien watched Tyler begin filming and made a mental note that this entire interaction was being documented by multiple passengers, which would prove useful in the federal civil rights lawsuit that was now inevitable given the direction this situation was heading. "Captain Kane," Damien said, his voice remaining steady despite the increasingly hostile environment surrounding him. "I strongly advise you to reconsider your approach to this situation. I am sitting in a seat that I purchased legally. I have not violated any federal aviation regulations, and I have been nothing but respectful to your crew despite their unprovoked harassment." The word harassment hit Linda like a slap, because it accurately described her behavior in legal terms, and she realized for the first time that this quiet passenger might have more knowledge of airline regulations and passenger rights than she had anticipated when she started this confrontation. Kane, however, interpreted Damien's measured response as a challenge to his authority that required an immediate and overwhelming show of force. "Port Authority," he barked to Linda. "Call them now. Tell them we have a Level 2 security threat who is refusing to comply with crew instructions and disrupting the safety of this aircraft." The escalation to security threat was the point where the situation crossed from customer service dispute into potential federal crime territory, and Damien realized with crystalline clarity that these people were about to make the most expensive mistake in commercial aviation history. He pulled out his phone and opened the secure connection to his brother Isaiah Cross, the head of Eclipse Capital's legal division and the most ruthlessly effective corporate attorney in New York. The contact information was already displayed on his screen as he watched Linda make her phone call to Port Authority, with the kind of vindictive satisfaction that came from finally having official backing for her prejudices. 2 Port Authority officers boarded the aircraft 3 minutes later, looking like men who had dealt with far too many airline passenger disputes and wanted nothing more than to resolve this situation quickly so they could return to more important security matters. They approached row 1 with the weary professionalism of people who had seen every possible variation of airline drama and assumed this would be just another routine removal. This, the passenger, the older officer, asked Kane, gesturing toward Damien with the kind of casual indifference that suggested he had already decided how this situation would end, based solely on the visual evidence of a black man in casual clothes sitting in first class. That's him, Kane confirmed with obvious satisfaction. Refusing crew instructions, causing a disturbance and interfering with the safety of the aircraft. I want him removed immediately. The younger officer approached Damien with his hand resting casually on his radio, a gesture that was designed to be intimidating, but mainly served to confirm that this entire situation had now devolved into exactly the kind of racially charged law enforcement encounter that would generate months of negative media coverage for everyone involved. "Sir, you're going to need to come with us," the officer said with the kind of false reasonableness that police officers used when they wanted cooperation, but were prepared to use force if necessary to achieve their goals. Damien looked at his Patek Philippe watch and noted the time 6:47 p.m. He would remember this moment for the rest of his life, not because of the humiliation he was about to endure, but because it marked the exact instant when Skyward Airlines began its journey toward complete corporate destruction. "Officers," Damien said calmly, "I need you to understand that I am about to make a phone call that will have consequences far beyond this aircraft. I am trying to give everyone involved one last opportunity to de-escalate this situation before it becomes something much larger than a simple seat dispute." The warning was delivered without threats or raised voices, but something in Damien's tone made the older officer pause for just a moment, as if some instinct was telling him that this passenger was not quite what he appeared to be. But Kane's impatience overwhelmed any possibility of rational reflection. "Take him," the captain ordered. "I don't care what calls he wants to make. Get him off my aircraft immediately." The officers moved forward, and Damien realized that the point of no return had finally arrived. He pressed the contact for Isaiah Cross as the first officer's hand closed around his arm, and his brother answered on the first ring with the instant alertness of someone who had been waiting for this call. "Execute Phoenix Protocol," Damien said quietly into his phone as the officers began pulling him from his seat. "Skyward Airlines Flight 447. Full corporate termination. No exceptions." Isaiah's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the growing commotion in the cabin. "Damien, that's the nuclear option. Are you absolutely certain? They ripped my lucky hoodie?" "Isaiah?" Damien replied as the officers dragged him toward the aisle, his voice carrying a note of finality that made it clear this decision was irrevocable. "The one I wore to the Amazon IPO. The one Mom gave me for Princeton graduation." There was a moment of silence on the phone, and then Isaiah's voice came back cold as winter steel. "Phoenix Protocol is now active. Corporate destruction commencing in 60 seconds. The passengers in first class watched in stunned silence as the 2 Port Authority officers dragged Damien Cross down the aisle of Flight 447, his torn hoodie leaving a trail of expensive cotton fibers that would soon become the most costly fabric in aviation history. Tyler Richmond held his phone high, capturing every moment of what he assumed would be a viral video celebrating the removal of someone who didn't belong in first class. What none of them could see was the war room at Eclipse Capital headquarters in Manhattan, where Isaiah Cross was already coordinating the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike against Skyward Airlines. Within 30 seconds of receiving Damien's call, 6 different departments were executing pre-planned strategies that had been designed specifically for this type of corporate retaliation. The beauty of Eclipse Capital's business model was that it didn't just invest in companies. It strategically positioned itself to control the financial lifelines that kept major corporations breathing. 8 months earlier, when Skyward Airlines had desperately needed cash to avoid bankruptcy, they had sold their debt portfolio to what they assumed was a passive hedge fund called Blue Sky Ventures. Blue Sky Ventures was actually a wholly owned subsidiary of Eclipse Capital, which meant that Damien Cross personally held the paper on every aircraft in Skyward's fleet, every fuel contract that kept their planes in the air, and every insurance policy that kept them legally operational. What had appeared to be a financial lifeline had actually been a carefully constructed trap that was now about to snap shut with devastating efficiency. In the cockpit of Flight 447, Captain Kane was feeling particularly satisfied with himself as he began the engine startup sequence, confident that he had handled the passenger situation with appropriate authority and decisiveness. His radio crackled with the familiar voices of air traffic control as he prepared to request pushback clearance from the gate. Tower, this is Skyward 447, requesting pushback for departure to London Heathrow. Kane transmitted with the kind of professional competence that came from 20 years of routine operations. Skyward 447, hold position, came the immediate response from the tower. We're showing some irregularities in your flight plan. Stand by for instructions. Kane frowned and looked at his first officer, a younger man named Davis, who had learned to read his captain's moods with the survival instincts of someone who worked for a volatile commander. Probably just paperwork, Davis suggested, hopefully, though something in the tower's tone had carried an unusual note of urgency. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the air conditioning packs suddenly shut down as the flight management computer received a priority signal from Eclipse Capital's IT security division. The screens that controlled everything from navigation to engine monitoring flickered, once went black, and then displayed a message that made Kane's blood pressure spike to dangerous levels. Lease expired. System lockout. Unauthorized operation detected. The ACR's printer in the cockpit began chattering with the mechanical persistence of a machine that had urgent information to deliver, producing a continuous stream of paper that Davis grabbed and began reading with increasing alarm. Captain Davis said, his voice cracking slightly as he processed the legal language scrolling across the printout. This is from something called Obsidian Legal Services. They're claiming ownership of our aircraft and ordering us to shut down engines immediately. Kane snatched the paper from Davis's hands and read the formal notice of asset seizure, his eyes widening as he realized that the passenger he had just ordered removed was named as the primary creditor in what appeared to be a legitimate legal document claiming ownership of the Boeing 787 they were sitting in. This is impossible, Kane muttered. But even as he spoke, his radio exploded with urgent communications from air traffic control ground operations and Skyward Airlines headquarters, all trying to understand why their entire fleet had suddenly been locked out of essential operating systems. In Chicago, Skyward Airlines CEO Patricia Hayes was in the middle of cutting into a perfectly prepared filet mignon when her phone began buzzing with the kind of insistent urgency that indicated her company was experiencing a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. She ignored the first few calls, assuming they were routine operational issues that could wait until after dinner. But when her CFO, Sarah Kim, burst into the executive dining room with her tablet clutched against her chest and panic written across her face, Patricia knew that her evening was about to take a dramatic turn for the worse. "Patricia, we need to talk immediately," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled terror that came from someone who had just watched their company's entire financial foundation collapse in real time. "Eclipse Capital just triggered the acceleration clauses on our debt package." The words hit Patricia like a physical blow because she knew exactly what they meant in practical terms. The acceleration clauses were the financial equivalent of a nuclear weapon, allowing the creditor to demand immediate payment of the entire loan balance if certain conditions were met, including the nebulous category of reputational harm to creditor representatives. How much, Patricia asked, though she already knew the answer would be catastrophic. $2.3 billion, Sarah replied. Due immediately, plus penalties and fees. They're demanding payment within 24 hours, or they're seizing all assets and initiating Chapter 7 liquidation proceedings. Patricia felt the room spin around her as the implications became clear. Chapter 7 wasn't reorganization or restructuring. It was corporate death, the complete dissolution of everything she had spent 15 years building. Who authorized this acceleration? She asked desperately. Sarah consulted her tablet with trembling fingers. The primary creditor is listed as Damien Cross, acting as managing partner of Eclipse Capital, Patricia. They're saying we assaulted their managing partner on Flight 447, and that this constitutes gross negligence and reputational harm. The name Damien Cross meant nothing to Patricia, but the realization that her airline's entire financial structure had just been weaponized against them by someone she had never heard of was almost too overwhelming to process. "Get him on the phone," she ordered frantically. "I can't," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "His assistant says Mr. Cross is currently unavailable because he's being detained by law enforcement at our request." The genius of Eclipse Capital's financial warfare strategy was its surgical precision targeting not just Skyward Airlines but the entire ecosystem of vendors, suppliers, and contractors that kept the airline operational on a daily basis. Within 20 minutes of Damien's phone call, fuel suppliers across 3 continents received automated notifications that their contracts with Skyward had been terminated due to cross-default provisions. Insurance underwriters who had provided liability coverage for Skyward's fleet found themselves facing immediate cancellation clauses that had been buried deep in the fine print of policies they had written years earlier, assuming the triggering conditions would never actually occur. The legal language was dense and complex, but the practical result was simple. Every Skyward aircraft was now uninsured and therefore legally grounded. Federal aviation authorities who monitored airline operations with the vigilance of air traffic controllers began receiving automated reports that Skyward Airlines no longer met the basic financial requirements for maintaining their Part 121 operating certificate. The cascade of contract breaches and insurance cancellations created a regulatory crisis that would require weeks to resolve, assuming the airline survived long enough to attempt resolution. Back on Flight 447, the passengers were beginning to realize that something far more serious than a simple passenger removal was unfolding around them. The air conditioning had died completely, leaving 300 people breathing stale air that was growing warmer by the minute, and the captain's announcements had evolved from confident assurances to increasingly desperate requests for passenger patience. Tyler Richmond, who had been live-streaming his triumph over the disruptive passenger, found himself trying to explain to his Instagram followers why his flight to London was now sitting motionless at the gate with no power and no apparent explanation from the crew. The narrative he had been crafting about entitled troublemakers getting their comeuppance was beginning to collapse as reality intruded on his social media fantasy. Linda Walsh stood in the forward galley pressing buttons on communication equipment that no longer responded to her commands. Her earlier confidence replaced by growing panic as she realized that her simple passenger management decision had somehow triggered a cascade of technical failures that she couldn't understand or control. The irony was not lost on the passengers in economy class who had watched the drama in first class with mixture of entertainment and moral discomfort, that they were now sharing the consequences of decisions made by people who had treated them as invisible throughout the boarding process. The artificial hierarchy that separated first class from economy became meaningless when the air conditioning died and everyone found themselves equally uncomfortable. At Eclipse Capital headquarters, Damien's executive assistant was fielding phone calls from reporters, federal regulators, and congressional staffers who had somehow learned about the developing crisis within minutes of its inception. The story was spreading across social media with the viral velocity that only comes from combining corporate malfeasance with clear video evidence of injustice. The hashtag Skyward Scandal was already trending on Twitter, accompanied by Tyler Richmond's own footage of Damien being dragged from his seat, but the narrative was evolving in ways that Tyler had never anticipated. Instead of celebrating the removal of a troublemaker, viewers were expressing outrage at the treatment of a passenger who had clearly done nothing wrong. Financial markets, which operated on fear and uncertainty with the efficiency of finely tuned instruments, began responding to the crisis before most Americans had even heard about it. Skyward's stock price plummeted 40% in after-hours trading as algorithmic trading systems detected the pattern of contract breaches and insurance cancellations. Credit rating agencies that monitored corporate debt obligations received automated notifications that Skyward Airlines had triggered multiple default scenarios, simultaneously creating a financial profile that looked more like a Ponzi scheme collapse than a routine business dispute. The beauty of Damien's strategy was that it required no illegal activity, no regulatory violations, and no breach of contract on Eclipse Capital's part. Everything they were doing was perfectly legal, meticulously documented, and based on contractual provisions that Skyward's own lawyers had agreed to when they desperately needed cash 8 months earlier. Patricia Hayes found herself in the surreal position of watching her company die in real time while she sat in a luxury restaurant surrounded by the trappings of corporate success that were now revealed as elaborate stage props in a performance that was about to end permanently. The phone calls from board members began within 30 minutes, each conversation shorter and more desperate than the last, as seasoned business executives realized that they were facing personal financial ruin if they remained associated with a company that was now toxic to touch. Patricia. I'm resigning. Effective immediately came the voice of her longtime board chairman, a man who had weathered countless corporate crises, but had never seen anything like the destruction that was now consuming Skyward Airlines. My lawyers say that staying on the board exposes me to personal liability for whatever happens next. One by one, the institutional framework that supported Skyward Airlines began collapsing. As banks froze credit lines, vendors demanded immediate payment for services, and government regulators launched investigations into how an airline could go from operational to grounded in less than an hour. The most devastating realization for everyone involved was that this was not a temporary setback or a crisis that could be managed through public relations and legal maneuvering. This was corporate execution carried out with the precision of a Swiss watch by someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. As the magnitude of the destruction became clear, even the federal authorities who had been summoned to arrest Damien Cross began to understand that they were not dealing with a disruptive passenger, but with someone who possessed the power to eliminate entire corporations with a single phone call, and who had just demonstrated that power with terrifying effectiveness. The arrest of Damien Cross lasted exactly 47 minutes, which was precisely long enough for Eclipse Capital's legal team to file federal civil rights violation charges against Skyward Airlines, Captain Robert Kane, Linda Walsh, and the Port Authority officers who had participated in what was now being characterized as a racially motivated assault on a paying passenger. The irony was exquisite. While Damien sat in a holding cell at JFK Airport, his lawyers were simultaneously filing motions in federal court that would ultimately result in criminal charges against everyone who had conspired to remove him from Flight 447. The legal system that had been weaponized against him was now turning its full attention to those who had abused their authority. Linda Walsh found herself in the surreal position of being arrested at her workplace by the same Port Authority officers who had helped her remove Damien from the aircraft. The charge was filing a false police report regarding a federal security threat, a felony that carried a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison and permanent disbarment from working in commercial aviation. What made Linda's situation particularly tragic was that the union she had served faithfully for 15 years immediately disavowed her actions, issuing a statement that union representation was not available for members who committed felonies outside the scope of their employment duties. She was facing federal charges with a public defender and no financial support from the organization she had believed would protect her. Captain Kane's fall from grace was even more spectacular because his military background had given him a deep understanding of hierarchical authority, making his abuse of that authority particularly inexcusable in the eyes of federal prosecutors. His pilot's license was immediately suspended pending investigation, and insurance companies that provided liability coverage for commercial pilots sent him registered letters terminating his policies. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an investigation into Kane's command decisions that would ultimately reveal a pattern of passenger intimidation and crew misconduct dating back several years. What had once been dismissed as strong leadership was now being re-examined through the lens of civil rights violations and abuse of federal authority. Tyler Richmond discovered that his father's media empire, which had taught him that wealth could purchase immunity from consequences, was actually incredibly vulnerable to public relations disasters. Richmond Media Group's stock price fell 12% in the first trading day after Tyler's video went viral, not because of the company's financial performance, but because advertisers were fleeing anything associated with the Richmond name. The conversation between Tyler and his father, Robert Richmond, took place in a conference room that had once symbolized power and influence, but now felt like a courtroom where final judgment was being rendered. "Your trust fund is frozen indefinitely," Robert said without preamble, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had built an empire and was now protecting it from his own son. "This can't be about one video," Tyler protested, still unable to grasp the magnitude of what his casual cruelty had set in motion. "It was just some guy on a plane. This will blow over in a week." Robert's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Some guy on a plane just destroyed a $4 billion airline because you thought it would be entertaining to watch him get dragged away from a seat he had paid for." Eclipse Capital canceled $10 million in advertising with our network because they said our brand values, specifically your behavior, don't align with their corporate philosophy. The realization that his privilege was not just being temporarily suspended but permanently revoked hit Tyler like a physical blow. He had never worked a day in his life, never developed any skills beyond spending money and attracting social media attention, and now he was facing a world where his name was more likely to close doors than open them. Patricia Hayes learned about her termination through a conference call with the remaining board members, all of whom were speaking through lawyers who specialized in corporate liability and personal asset protection. The conversation was brief and brutal. Her employment was terminated immediately, her severance package was voided due to the crisis she had overseen, and she was personally responsible for any civil damages that resulted from the incident. The speed with which her corporate colleagues abandoned her was breathtaking, transforming 15 years of professional relationships into legal liabilities that needed to be severed as quickly as possible. The same board members who had celebrated her cost-cutting measures and aggressive passenger policies were now claiming they had never supported such practices. What made the collapse particularly devastating was its comprehensiveness. This wasn't just about losing jobs or facing criminal charges. It was about the complete destruction of identities that had been built around institutional power and social hierarchy. Linda had defined herself as a senior flight attendant, Kane as a commanding pilot, Tyler as a social media influencer, and Patricia as a successful CEO. Overnight, they had become unemployed, unemployable, and infamous in ways that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The internet never forgets, and their names were now permanently associated with one of the most spectacular examples of corporate self-destruction in business history. The ripple effects extended far beyond the primary participants, touching the lives of 40,000 Skyward employees who woke up to discover that their company no longer existed as a functioning entity. Mechanics, baggage handlers, gate agents, and flight attendants who had never heard of Damien Cross found themselves unemployed because of decisions made by executives they had never met. The human cost was staggering, families facing mortgage payments without income, College students losing tuition, assistance retirees watching pension funds evaporate, and entire communities built around airport employment facing economic devastation. 6 months later, the landscape of consequence had settled into patterns that would have seemed impossible when Flight 447 was still sitting at the gate with dreams of departure to London. The individuals responsible for the crisis had been scattered to various forms of exile, each facing a different version of the same fundamental truth. Actions have consequences, and some consequences are permanent. Robert Kane found himself standing on the frozen tarmac of Dutch Harbor, Alaska, wearing heavy work boots and a parka that smelled of diesel fuel and desperation. The temperature was 23 degrees below zero, and the wind was strong enough to knock a man down if he wasn't careful about his footing on the ice-covered ground. His new employer was a cargo operation called Arctic Freight, which specialized in flying supplies to remote fishing villages and oil drilling platforms where commercial airlines feared to operate. The aircraft were decades old, minimally maintained, and operated under weather conditions that violated every safety protocol Kane had once enforced as a commercial pilot. "Kane, get that fish loaded before it freezes. Solid," shouted Big Jim Morrison, the owner of Arctic Freight, and a man who looked like he had been carved from glacial ice and seasoned with industrial-grade cynicism. "We've got a delivery window in Barrow, and if we miss it, those people don't eat this week." The work was physically demanding, financially inadequate, and professionally humiliating for someone who had once commanded million-dollar aircraft filled with hundreds of passengers. Kane's daily routine now involved loading cargo-checking weather conditions that would have grounded any sane pilot and flying routes that tested both his skills and his mortality. Every morning, Kane looked at himself in the cracked mirror of his shared trailer and saw a man who had traded respect for arrogance and authority for intimidation, ultimately losing both in a moment of casual cruelty that had cost him everything he thought mattered about his professional identity. 3,000 miles away, Linda Walsh was discovering that 15 years of experience in commercial aviation qualified her for exactly nothing in the world outside airline employment. Her criminal conviction for filing a false police report had made her unemployable in any position that required background checks, which eliminated most service industry jobs that might have used her customer relations experience. The Queen's Diner where she now worked was a universe away from the first-class cabin where she had once wielded authority over passengers who treated her with the deference her uniform commanded. Now she wore a grease-stained apron and served coffee to customers who recognized her from viral videos and treated her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "Excuse me," said a young woman at table 4 holding up her phone with Linda's mugshot displayed on the screen. "Aren't you the flight attendant who lied to the police about that billionaire? My friends and I were just talking about that case in our criminology class. The daily humiliation of being recognized as a viral villain was almost harder to bear than the financial hardship of working for minimum wage plus tips." Linda had lost her pension, her health insurance, her professional identity, and her ability to travel, leaving her trapped in a 5-mile radius around her apartment building. Tyler Richmond's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic because he had never experienced genuine hardship or accountability in his 28 years of existence. The trust fund freeze had forced him into a studio apartment in Brooklyn, a neighborhood he had previously known only as a punchline in conversations about where poor people lived. His landlord was a Korean War veteran named Mr. Chen, who had no patience for Tyler's explanations about temporary financial difficulties and expected rent payments on time, regardless of what social media influencer problems Tyler might be experiencing. Mr. Richmond. Mr. Chen had said during their first conversation about late rent, "I don't care who your father is or what happened to your money. You pay rent or you leave. This is not complicated mathematics." Tyler's attempts to monetize his viral fame had backfired spectacularly when potential sponsors realized that associating their brands with his behavior would generate negative publicity rather than positive engagement. His Instagram followers had initially increased after the incident, But they were hate-following rather than genuine fans leaving comments that reminded him daily of his role in destroying an airline. The job market proved particularly unforgiving for someone whose only qualifications were spending money and attracting attention on social media platforms. Employers who Googled his name found thousands of articles describing his behavior on Flight 447, making him essentially unemployable in any position that involved customer contact or corporate representation. Patricia Hayes had thought her executive experience and business school credentials would insulate her from the kind of personal consequences that were destroying her subordinates. But she discovered that corporate leadership carried heavier penalties than middle management positions when spectacular failures occurred. The wrongful termination lawsuit she had filed against Skyward's board was dismissed when her lawyers realized that her employment contract included specific clauses about executive responsibility for civil rights violations and reputational damage that made her termination legally justified. Her professional network, which had once opened doors across the airline industry, now treated her like radioactive material that could contaminate anyone who associated with her. The same executives who had praised her cost-cutting strategies were now testifying in congressional hearings about the toxic culture she had created. The financial ruin was comprehensive legal fees, civil liability, and the collapse of her stock options and retirement accounts left her facing bankruptcy at an age when she should have been planning for comfortable retirement. The congressional hearing room was designed to intimidate witnesses with its marble columns, formal galleries, and raised podium where representatives could look down on those called to testify about their failures. Damian Cross sat at the witness table with the calm composure of someone who had been invited to share expertise rather than summoned to face judgment. Representative Maria Santos, the chair of the House Transportation Committee, had spent weeks preparing for this hearing because the Skyward Airlines incident had become a symbol of broader problems in the aviation industry that demanded federal intervention and regulatory reform. Mr. Cross-Representative Santos began her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for civil rights and social justice. Can you describe for this committee the sequence of events that led to your removal from Flight 447 and the subsequent collapse of Skyward Airlines? Damian's testimony was delivered with the precision of someone who understood that his words would be studied by legal scholars and business ethicists for decades to come. He spoke about the assumptions made based on his appearance, the escalation of authority when his legitimate concerns were dismissed, and the decision to exercise his legal and financial rights when diplomatic solutions were rejected. Representative Santos Damian said what happened on Flight 447 was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of discrimination that affects thousands of passengers annually. The difference in my case was that I had the resources to demand accountability when that discrimination occurred. The committee had invited testimony from dozens of passengers who had experienced similar treatment on various airlines, and their stories painted a picture of pervasive bias that was built into the structure of commercial aviation rather than isolated to individual bad actors. Dr. Jennifer Williams, a professor of social psychology at Georgetown University, testified about research showing that passenger complaints about discrimination were routinely dismissed or minimized by airline customer service departments, creating a culture where bias was not just tolerated, but institutionally protected. The power dynamics inherent in commercial aviation. Dr. Williams explained to the committee create situations where crew members can act on personal prejudices with minimal oversight or accountability. Passengers have no meaningful recourse when they face discrimination because the crew's authority is treated as absolute. Federal Aviation Administrator Rebecca Chen testified about regulatory gaps that allowed airlines to prioritize operational efficiency over passenger rights, creating environments where crew members felt pressure to remove passengers quickly rather than address conflicts through dialogue and de-escalation. The most damaging testimony came from former Skyward employees who described corporate policies that explicitly encouraged crew members to remove passengers who didn't fit the premium cabin demographic without requiring any documentation or justification for their decisions. Flight attendant supervisor Michelle Torres, who had worked for Skyward for 12 years before the company's collapse, testified under oath about training sessions where crew members were instructed to trust their instincts about whether passengers belonged in first-class accommodations. We were told that protecting the premium cabin experience was our primary responsibility. Torres testified, her voice shaking as she described policies that she now recognized as institutionalized discrimination. If a passenger didn't look like they belonged in first class, we were expected to find reasons to move them. Captain Michael Rodriguez, who had flown for multiple airlines over a 25-year career, testified about command authority that was routinely abused to intimidate passengers rather than ensure safety, creating a culture where pilots felt entitled to treat aircraft like personal kingdoms. The Department of Transportation's civil rights investigation had uncovered similar patterns at 17 other major airlines, suggesting that the Skyward incident was representative of industry-wide problems rather than isolated corporate failures. Transportation Secretary David Kim announced new federal regulations requiring anti-bias training for all airline employees, passenger advocate programs at every major airport, and federal oversight of passenger removal procedures to prevent future discrimination. The right to travel with dignity is not negotiable, Secretary Kim testified. Commercial aviation is a public accommodation, and we will use every tool at our disposal to ensure that every passenger is treated with respect regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived social status. The economic analysis presented to the committee showed that the Skyward collapse had cost the American economy over $4 billion in lost productivity, stranded passenger expenses, and unemployment benefits, making it one of the most expensive customer service failures in business history. Legal scholars testified that the case had created new precedents for corporate accountability and civil rights enforcement that would influence business practices far beyond the airline industry, establishing principles about institutional responsibility for individual employee actions. The hearing concluded with Representative Santos announcing bipartisan legislation that would create a Passenger Bill of Rights, establish federal oversight of airline discrimination policies, and provide legal remedies for passengers who experienced bias during air travel. As Damien left the hearing room, he was approached by dozens of passengers who had experienced similar discrimination but lacked the resources to demand accountability. Their stories reinforced his belief that the Skyward incident had been necessary to expose problems that would have continued indefinitely without dramatic intervention. The liquidation auction for Skyward Airlines assets took place in a converted airplane hangar at Chicago O'Hare Airport, where the physical remnants of a once proud airline were being sold to the highest bidder under the supervision of federal bankruptcy courts. Damian Cross walked through the rows of aircraft equipment and corporate furnishings with the measured pace of someone who was not browsing but conducting a final inspection of property he intended to own. Eclipse Capital's bid for the entire Skyward portfolio was not just the highest offer received, it was more than double the next closest competitor, ensuring that Damien would have complete control over what rose from the ashes of the airline that had made the mistake of judging him by his appearance rather than his bank account. The symbolic significance of the auction was not lost on anyone present in the hangar. The same aircraft that had been used to humiliate Damien were now legally becoming his property, along with every gate, every maintenance facility, and every corporate asset that had been built over decades of airline operations. Mr. Cross announced the federal auctioneer, "You are now the legal owner of all assets, intellectual property, routes, and facilities previously operated by Skyward Airlines. Congratulations on your successful acquisition." The transformation from Skyward Airlines to Eclipse Airways was not simply a matter of changing logos and paint schemes. It represented a complete philosophical overhaul of what commercial aviation could become when operated according to principles of dignity, respect, and genuine customer service rather than hierarchy and intimidation. Damien's first decision as owner was to invite applications from former Skyward employees who wanted to be considered for positions with Eclipse Airways, but only after completing comprehensive training programs that emphasized empathy, cultural sensitivity, and passenger advocacy rather than authority and compliance. The application process was designed to identify employees who had been complicit in the old culture versus those who had been uncomfortable with discriminatory practices but lacked the power to challenge them. Many middle managers who had enforced toxic policies found themselves permanently excluded, while frontline employees who had treated passengers with genuine respect were offered opportunities for advancement. Linda Walsh's application for a position with Eclipse Airways was perhaps the most scrutinized document in the entire hiring process, not because Damien bore personal grudges, but because her case would establish precedents for how the new airline would handle redemption and accountability. The interview took place in a conference room overlooking the hangar where Eclipse Airways aircraft were being retrofitted with new interiors designed to eliminate the artificial barriers between passenger classes that had enabled discrimination to flourish. "Mrs. Walsh," Damien said, sitting across from Linda at a simple table without the power dynamics that had characterized their previous interaction, "I want to understand what you've learned from the events of Flight 447 and how you believe you could contribute to creating a different kind of airline culture." Linda's response was delivered without the defensive justifications or blame shifting that had characterized her initial legal testimony. "Mr. Cross, I spent 15 years perpetuating a culture that treated passengers as obstacles rather than human beings. I used my authority to intimidate people who reminded me of my own humble background because I was afraid of losing the small amount of power I had achieved." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours and covered Linda's childhood in rural Alabama, her experiences with class discrimination, and her gradual transformation from victim to perpetrator of the same prejudices that had once wounded her. "I can't undo what I did to you," Linda concluded, "but I can spend whatever time I have left in this industry making sure that no passenger ever experiences what I put you through. If you give me that opportunity, I will use every lesson I learned from losing everything to help train other employees about the consequences of treating people as less than human." Damien's decision to offer Linda a position as a diversity training coordinator was controversial among Eclipse Airways executives, but it reflected his belief that genuine accountability required opportunities for redemption, rather than permanent exile for those who demonstrated authentic growth. Captain Robert Kane's meeting with Damien took place 6 months later after Kane had spent a brutal winter flying cargo routes in Alaska that had taught him humility in ways that military service and commercial aviation had never required. The conversation occurred in Eclipse Airways' new training facility where pilots learned to treat their authority as a responsibility to serve passengers rather than a license to intimidate them. Captain Kane Damien began. "I've been following your work with Arctic Freight and the letters you've been writing to veteran support groups about leadership accountability. I'm interested in your thoughts about what went wrong on Flight 447 and how commercial aviation might develop better command structures." Kane's response reflected months of reflection during long, dangerous flights over frozen wilderness, where survival depended on competence rather than authority. "Mr. Cross, I spent 20 years confusing command with control authority, with intimidation. I thought that demanding immediate obedience made me a strong leader when it actually made me a weak human being who needed to diminish others to feel powerful." The position Damien offered Kane was not as a pilot because Kane's license remained under review, but as a safety instructor who would teach other pilots about the difference between legitimate authority and power abuse, using his own failures as case studies in command responsibility. Tyler Richmond's transformation took longer because he had never experienced genuine hardship before the trust fund freeze forced him to confront the reality of supporting himself through actual work rather than social media performance. His meeting with Damien occurred after Tyler had spent 8 months working retail jobs, paying rent in a studio apartment, and volunteering with civil rights organizations as part of a court-ordered community service program related to his role in the Flight 447 incident. "Mr. Richmond," Damien said, noting the calloused hands and worn clothing that marked Tyler's transition from privileged influencer to working person, "I understand you've been volunteering with the NAACP's Transportation Equity Project. Can you tell me what you've learned from that experience?" Tyler's answer reflected a fundamental shift in perspective that had occurred as he experienced life without financial safety nets or social connections to protect him from consequences. "Mr. Cross, I spent 28 years thinking that wealth made me better than other people, when it just gave me the privilege to avoid learning about dignity, respect, and the basic humanity that connects all of us." The most significant conversation in the Eclipse Airways transformation occurred not in a corporate boardroom or legal conference room, but in the simple office space that Damien had chosen for his airline headquarters, deliberately designed without the intimidating luxury that characterized most executive environments. Linda Walsh sat across from Damien on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after she had begun working as Eclipse Airways Director of Dignity Training, a position that required her to share her own story of discrimination and redemption with every new employee who joined the airline. "Mr. Cross," Linda began, "I wanted to talk with you about something that's been weighing on my mind since I started working here. I see the way other employees look at me sometimes, wondering how someone who did what I did to you ended up in a position of responsibility at your airline." Damien set down his coffee cup and gave Linda his full attention, recognizing that this conversation represented a crucial moment in both her personal journey and the broader cultural transformation he was trying to create throughout Eclipse Airways. "Linda," he replied, "the reason I offered you this position wasn't to forgive what you did or to demonstrate corporate magnanimity. It was because genuine change requires people who understand the real cost of prejudice and discrimination, not just intellectually, but personally and professionally." The conversation that followed explored the difference between punishment and accountability, between justice and revenge, and between creating consequences and creating opportunities for growth. Linda described the months of therapy and self-reflection that had been required to understand how she had become someone who would lie to police officers to remove a passenger based solely on appearance. "I realized that I had been so afraid of being powerless again that I became someone who abused whatever small amount of power I had," Linda explained. "Working here, training other employees, sharing my story with people who might make similar mistakes. This feels like the first meaningful work I've ever done." Damien's response reflected his belief that transformation was only possible when people faced genuine consequences for their actions, while also being offered pathways to contribute positively to the changes they had helped make necessary. "The goal was never to destroy you, Linda," he said. "The goal was to create accountability for behavior that had been tolerated for too long. But accountability without opportunity for redemption just creates bitterness and resentment rather than learning and growth." Captain Kane's journey through the Eclipse Airways redemption process was more complicated because his military background had given him a deeper understanding of hierarchy and command authority, making his abuse of that authority more serious from a professional ethics standpoint. His position as safety and command responsibility instructor required him to teach pilot training courses where his own failures on Flight 447 served as primary case studies in what could go wrong when authority was exercised without wisdom or restraint. Captain Kane Damien said during one of their regular review meetings, "I want to make sure you understand that your role here isn't about rehabilitation or second chances. It's about using your experience to prevent other pilots from making similar mistakes that could destroy their careers and harm passengers." Kane's response reflected the humility that had been forced on him by months of flying dangerous cargo routes in weather conditions that had taught him the difference between genuine leadership and authoritarian posturing. Mr. Cross Kane replied, "I spent 20 years thinking that command meant making decisions quickly and enforcing them without question. What I learned in Alaska is that real leadership means taking responsibility for outcomes, protecting people under your authority, and having the courage to admit mistakes before they become catastrophes." Tyler Richmond's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic because he had never experienced genuine accountability or consequences before the events of Flight 447 forced him to confront the reality of life without inherited privilege and social protection. His role with Eclipse Airways was limited to community outreach and passenger advocacy positions that required him to interact with people who had experienced discrimination and to help develop policies that would prevent future incidents of bias in commercial aviation. Mr. Richmond Damien said during Tyler's performance evaluation after his first year with the company, "I want to hear your thoughts about what you've learned from working with passengers who have faced discrimination, and how that's changed your understanding of privilege and responsibility." Tyler's answer reflected a fundamental shift in his worldview that had occurred as he experienced life without financial safety nets and social connections to protect him from the consequences of his actions and attitudes. Mr. Cross Tyler said, "I used to think that wealth and social status gave me the right to take up space and demand attention without considering how that affected other people. Working with passengers who have faced discrimination has shown me that dignity and respect aren't privileges that you earn through money or family connections. They're basic human rights that everyone deserves." The Eclipse Airways transformation was not just about individual redemption stories, but about creating an entire corporate culture that prioritized human dignity over operational efficiency, passenger welfare over profit margins, and authentic service over performative customer relations. The training programs that Linda developed became industry standards that were adopted by other airlines, while Kane's command responsibility courses became required education for commercial pilots throughout the aviation industry, and Tyler's community outreach work became a model for corporate accountability programs. What emerged from the ashes of Flight 447 was not just a new airline, but a new approach to commercial aviation that proved profitable businesses could be built on principles of dignity, respect, and genuine human connection rather than hierarchy, intimidation, and artificial social barriers. The inaugural flight of Eclipse Airways Flight 001 from JFK to London Heathrow represented more than just the rebirth of a commercial airline. It symbolized the possibility that entire industries could transform themselves when forced to confront the human cost of their established practices and prejudices. Damien Cross sat in Seat 1A, the same physical location where his journey through corporate destruction and reconstruction had begun, but now wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that reflected his role as the owner and philosophical architect of what many industry analysts were calling the most revolutionary approach to commercial aviation in decades. The passengers on Flight 001 included many of the people whose lives had been touched by the original incident: civil rights activists, former Skyward employees who had earned positions with Eclipse Airways journalists covering the airline's transformation, and passengers who had experienced discrimination on other carriers and wanted to support an airline built on different principles. Linda Walsh stood in the forward galley, wearing the Eclipse Airways uniform that she had helped design to eliminate the militaristic elements that had characterized traditional airline clothing, replacing them with professional attire that emphasized service rather than authority. As she prepared for the pre-flight safety demonstration, Linda reflected on the journey that had taken her from viral villain to respected educator, a transformation that had required her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself while building new skills in empathy and cultural sensitivity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Linda announced over the aircraft's public address system, her voice carrying the warmth and genuine care that had replaced her former authoritarian tone. "Welcome aboard Eclipse Airways Flight 001. My name is Linda, and I'm honored to be serving you today as we embark on what we hope will be a new standard for dignity and respect in commercial aviation. Captain Michael Chen, who had been personally recruited by Damien from a competitor airline known for its commitment to safety and passenger welfare, made the announcement that Flight 001 was ready for departure with the kind of calm professionalism that inspired confidence without demanding submission. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Damien looked out the window at the JFK terminal where his original flight had been canceled due to the corporate crisis his treatment had precipitated, and he felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. The transformation of commercial aviation that had begun with a torn hoodie in Seat 1A had spread far beyond Eclipse Airways, forcing other airlines to examine their own policies and practices regarding passenger discrimination, crew authority, and corporate accountability. Federal regulations now required annual bias training for all airline employees, passenger advocate programs at every major airport, and transparent reporting of discrimination complaints that were previously hidden within corporate customer service departments. The Eclipse Airways model had proven that treating passengers with genuine respect and dignity was not just ethically correct, but financially profitable as customer satisfaction scores reached unprecedented levels, while operational costs decreased due to reduced conflict and improved employee morale. As Flight 001 reached cruising altitude over the Atlantic Ocean, Damien opened his laptop and began working on the speech he would deliver at the International Air Transport Association conference in London, where he had been invited to present the Eclipse Airways approach as a case study in corporate transformation and social responsibility. The speech would focus not on the destruction of Skyward Airlines, but on the construction of something better, an industry culture that recognized commercial aviation as a public service rather than a private kingdom, where passenger rights were protected rather than violated, and where dignity was treated as a fundamental requirement rather than an optional upgrade. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother, Sarah, who had watched her son's transformation of an entire industry with the pride that came from seeing childhood lessons about dignity and respect implemented on a global scale. Damien. The message read, "I'm watching the news coverage of your inaugural flight, and I want you to know how proud I am that you chose to build something beautiful instead of just destroying something ugly. That hoodie I gave you for Princeton graduation has become a symbol of change for millions of people. Love, Mom." As Damien looked around the cabin of Flight 001, he saw passengers from different backgrounds, economic levels, and social positions, all receiving the same respectful treatment from crew members who had been trained to see human dignity as their primary responsibility, rather than operational efficiency or customer hierarchy. The framed photograph on his office wall showing his torn hoodie from Flight 447 would serve as a permanent reminder that justice often begins with someone refusing to accept treatment that diminishes their humanity, but it only becomes meaningful when that refusal leads to changes that protect others from experiencing similar degradation. Flight 001 landed at London Heathrow exactly on schedule, with passengers deplaning through a process that treated everyone with the same courtesy and attention, regardless of which cabin they had occupied or how much they had paid for their tickets. As Damien walked through Heathrow Airport toward his hotel, he was approached by a young black businessman who had recognized him from news coverage of the Eclipse Airways launch. "Mr. Cross," the man said, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did. I've been flying for business for 10 years, and I can't count the number of times I've been questioned about whether I belonged in first class or business class. What you built with Eclipse Airways gives people like us hope that travel can be about dignity rather than discrimination." The conversation reminded Damien that the transformation he had initiated was not complete and might never be complete, but that every person who traveled without fear of discrimination because of improved industry standards represented a victory for human dignity that made the entire struggle worthwhile. As he settled into his London hotel room, Damien reflected on the words he had spoken to the Port Authority officers almost exactly 1 year earlier. "Touch me again, and I'll buy this entire airline just to fire you personally." He had indeed bought the entire airline, but instead of using it for personal revenge, He had transformed it into something that served justice for everyone who traveled through the sky, proving that true power was most meaningful when it was used to lift others up rather than tear enemies down. The transformation rippled far beyond one airline. Within 2 years, federal legislation mandated dignity training for all transportation employees, and corporate accountability became the new standard across industries. Damien's Eclipse Airways became the model for ethical business practices, proving profitability and humanity could coexist while generating billions in economic value through genuine respect for human dignity. Linda Kane and Tyler each earned their redemption through authentic service and accountability. Their journeys from perpetrators to advocates becoming powerful testimonies in discrimination prevention programs nationwide. The cycle of prejudice was broken through education, understanding, and authentic change that rippled through families, communities, and institutions. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment, it's about transformation. From a torn hoodie in seat 1, came a revolution in how we treat each other in the sky and on the ground, because dignity isn't an upgrade you earn with miles or money. It's a human right you're born with, and it's worth fighting to protect for everyone who comes after you. If this story of corporate accountability and human dignity resonated with you, please hit that like button to help our channel reach others who need to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest stories about justice transformation and the power of standing up for what's right. What do you think? Was Damien's response proportional to the treatment he received, or should he have chosen a different path to justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember that every interaction we have is a choice between perpetuating harm or creating positive change in the world.